So hello and welcome to the video. I recently completed a trip that involved flying on 4 Star Alliance airlines, all in business class. This trip did many things. It allowed me to judge whether British Airways' short-haul business product is competitive. It got me to silver in Aegean's frequent flyer scheme, and as it turns out, it got me a chunk of the way towards gold as well. And it got me out of Europe for the first time in 20 months to one of my favourite places, Egypt. Having spent a couple of days in Cairo, I flew down to Luxor with EGYPTAIR in their domestic business class product. And to nick a footballing analogy, it really was a game of two halves, Trevor. I filmed an intro when I was on the ground in Cairo, but given what happened, it doesn't really work. The first half, from Cairo down to Luxor, was fine, but the second half, flying back to Cairo, well, in that 1-hour flight I saw 2 of the most astonishing safety failures I have ever seen an airline make. Now, I've been on 776 flights. I have a spreadsheet, and so I thought I'd seen everything, but what I saw on that EGYPTAIR flight really shocked me. So if you'd like to see what happened, stick around. Hi, I'm Matt. Over the last 25 years, I've travelled a lot. I've lived in 5 countries on 4 continents. I've flown over 1.3 million miles. I've visited over 100 countries, every American state, but I'm nowhere near done. So hit subscribe to see where I go next and perhaps get some inspiration for your next trip. I flew in and out of Cairo 4 times on this trip, and this was the only one that took place in daylight. EGYPTAIR flies domestically from Terminal 3 at Cairo Airport, which is also where most international flights depart. It's quite a pleasant space in daylight. As is common in airports in developing countries, there is a security checkpoint to enter the heart of the terminal. This one is actually further from the front door than they usually are, but you need to clear this before you can check in. This isn't the checkpoint where the size of your toothpaste is checked, but they will X-ray everything. This was the domestic checkpoint. The international checkpoint was at the other end of the terminal. There aren't that many domestic flights right now, but check-in was a little busy. My business class ticket allowed me to jump the queue. A 1-hour domestic flight, so it was refreshing not to have to worry about vaccine certificates or passenger locator forms. Then you take a gentle stroll through the terminal, past a very cursory document check, along a moving walkway, up an escalator, past a duty-free shop, which I didn't expect to see in a domestic terminal, but I didn't investigate in any detail except to note that there was no booze for sale. Eventually you reach the business lounge. As business class lounges go, I've seen better, but I think the point is to be grateful that there is one at all. EGYPTAIR is dry, so no booze was on offer, and everything that was on offer was individually wrapped, so it was a positive festival of single-use plastics. It got quite busy, so I couldn't easily film, but after an hour or so it quietened down and it was time to wander off to the gate. That's when the toothpaste security check did take place. Whenever you see an escalator leading down to your gate, your heart sinks a little as you realise it must be a bus gate. It was quite a busy flight, which was great for both EGYPTAIR and for my destination. There's still no international flights direct to Luxor, so everyone needs to connect domestically to get there. I tried to find a priority boarding line, but all I could find was a sign. As standing in the terminal was more appealing than fighting my way onto a crowded bus, I waited. Once it seemed that all economy passengers had shuffled through, I made my way onto the bus. There were no announcements during the boarding process, but it was pretty easy to work out what was happening, so it wasn't a big issue. A bit of a wait on the bus until the last economy passengers had been scooped up, but we were soon off on a tour of some of EGYPTAIR's mothballed planes, 3 Embraer 175s, which looked like they'd need quite a lot of work before they'd be airworthy again. And finally, our plane, an Airbus A220. Actually, my first Airbus A220. Quite an attractive looking plane. On board to be greeted by the obligatory sanitising wipe. A 3-2 configuration, 3 rows of business, and a surprisingly voluminous overhead bin that effortlessly swallowed my bag. very decent legroom, I'd say 32 or perhaps even 33 inches, a fixed tray table, and hold my non-alcoholic beverage, an in-seat charging point, and the promise of in-flight Wi-Fi. Water was handed out and things were looking pretty rosy. And EGYPTAIR had not kept any business class seats clear to space people out, except row 1. The 5 seats in row 1 were empty, and when one of the passengers tried to move after takeoff, she wasn't allowed to. I have no idea why, but I had no one sitting next to me, which was fortunate. Another oddity was that the seating started at row 20. You get a business class boarding pass showing row 21 and you do wonder what's going on. So we took off, a pretty clear day, and there was daylight, so let me share some of it. A snack was delivered pretty rapidly after takeoff, along with a juice box. I can't remember the last time I had a juice box, but it was pretty good. As was becoming a theme, no opportunity to provide single-use plastics was missed, including plastic knives and forks. I doubt anyone has ever eaten a cheese roll, a small pastry, or a selection of quite tasty biscuits with a knife and fork. No in-plane in-flight entertainment, but the X-plane in-flight entertainment was outstanding. Probably better on the right of the plane, where you'd get views of the Nile, but the Gulf of Suez worked for me. I actually dislike in-flight Wi-Fi. It used to be that an aircraft was one of the last places on Earth where you could actually completely disconnect, and I still really enjoy doing so. But I did check out the Wi-Fi for you, dear viewer, and it looked okay. A small free allowance and some reasonably priced options, although it was a very short flight. To get the chunk of free access, they wanted some personal information which I was disinclined to give, so didn't follow through with a connection. But if you absolutely need to connect in that 1 hour window of the flight, it seems possible. And all too soon it was time to land. Once again, quite spectacular views out of the window, and you can really see how significant the Nile is to Egypt from the irrigation it provides. Luxor has no terminal gates, so everyone takes a bus back to the terminal. They held back the economy passengers, so those of us in business had a bus to ourselves. A domestic flight, so no landing formalities, and I was very quickly through the terminal, ready to do battle with the local taxis. In summary, there were a few oddities, but overall it was a good example of how to operate a 1 hour domestic flight. Want to see how not to operate a 1 hour domestic flight? Alrighty then. Luxor back to Cairo was a 7:15 PM flight, and I got to the airport hopelessly early. Too early for the terminal entry security team, so I had to wait a while before they would let me into the building. I was too early for the check-in team too. Everyone ignored the passenger standing at the business class check-in counter for perhaps 15 minutes before someone could be bothered to do the honours. Then through the second toothpaste-oriented security point into the departure lounge. There's no Star Alliance lounge in Luxor Airport, which annoyingly I hadn't worked out before I got there, but I found a quiet corner and did some work. There's always more footage to edit. There was an extraordinarily expensive snack shop in the lounge where you could buy a beer for the flight. EGYPTAIR is dry, but they are very happy if you bring your own haram refreshments with you. Boarding was a bit of a scrum. I didn't film it, but it was one of those occasions where everyone seemed to be worried that the plane would leave without them if they weren't among the first 10 people to board. I held back and was one of the last to board the bus across the tarmac. To our plane, a Boeing 737-800. Looks nice, doesn't it? 11 years old, but take a look at those seats. It's been a very long time since I've been on a short-haul aircraft with seats like this. It's also been a while since I've had to evict someone who pinched my seat. Nice try. 6 rows of business in a 2-2 configuration.
Thank you.
I've tried to find out what's going on because I'd swear those seats were older than the aircraft. It felt like a 1980s reclining business class seat transplanted into a 737. 38 inches of pitch, which I am not complaining about. The table was in the armrest and unsurprisingly there was no in-seat power or Wi-Fi. It's the kind of seat that was so old it couldn't now be clean, and it felt like it hadn't been clean in 20 years. I wondered how long that SIM card holder had been in the seat pocket. But it was comfortable, luxurious even, for a 1-hour flight, although the metal bar that formed part of the footrest actually dug into the back of your thighs a bit. On this occasion the seats started at row 8, odd but less odd than the last flight. And then we encountered our first safety debacle. We were scheduled to depart at 7:15 p.m, but at 7:08 the boarding was complete and the pilots obviously had dinner reservations back in Cairo, so off we went. The in-seat TV obviously worked and the safety briefing was first shown in Arabic. It was pretty long and we were trundling very purposefully towards the runway, lights still on, safety briefing still playing. Then it started again, this time in English. It was still playing, lights on, as we crossed onto the active runway. It was still playing, lights on, when we were hurtling down the runway. It was still playing with the cabin lights on as we took off. From my footage I can report it only finished over a minute into our flight. Now the safety briefing tells you what to do in the event of an emergency, so although most people don't watch it, airlines do need to complete it before any significant flight event happens, which obviously includes the takeoff. But more importantly, your eyes take up to 10 minutes to acclimate to darkness, so by turning the lights off before takeoff, both passengers and crew have a better chance of seeing dangers outside the cabin if there's an emergency. Now we didn't experience an emergency on that takeoff, so you might argue that it doesn't really matter, but it's the crew's responsibility to prepare the cabin, so if they couldn't get that right, what else would they not get right? Stay tuned, dear viewer. The in-flight snack was identical to that on the outbound flight, except there were metal-coloured plastic knives and forks that no one would ever use, rather than the white plastic knives and forks that no one would ever use that we had on the outbound flight. We flew after dark, so there was nothing really to see out of the windows, and before long it was time to land. As I said, the pilots obviously had dinner reservations. And the cabin crew did absolutely nothing to prepare the cabin for landing. There was an announcement, then I never saw them again. All service items had been collected, so it might not perhaps have been a huge issue, except the lady across the aisle from me had invited her small daughter to sit on her lap during the flight, and as the crew made no passes through the cabin, the child remained on her mother's lap, unsecured, all the way through landing. They did turn the lights off for landing, and I feel bad for trying to film it, but it was a really appalling safety breach on both the mother and the crew's part. I have to credit DaVinci Resolve, my editing software here, for being able to turn this raw footage into this. I've wrestled with whether I should have done something at the time instead of just sitting there observing, but I wasn't certain that the child was unsecured until we landed and the lights came back on. It would have still been unsafe for her to be secured with her mother's safety belt, but it would have been less unsafe than not being secured at all. A domestic arrival, so it was a very rapid walk through the airport to try to find the bus to my airport hotel, which is a story for another day. Now, I don't want to get too sensationalist about this, although blowing the smallest incident up into a catastrophe in order to create a good video title does work for some YouTubers. As I've said, I've had 776 flights in my life, but these two shortcomings were two of the three most serious safety failures I've ever seen, and for them to occur on the same flight is remarkable. I'll add that the flight attendants consistently removed their face masks when in the galley, replacing them when they entered the passenger cabin. Both pilots left the cockpit during the flight and both scrupulously kept their masks on, so this was not a failing of the entire crew, although the pilots didn't rebuke the cabin crew when they saw them without masks. As the two flights contrasted so sharply, it's hard to draw a single conclusion about EGYPTAIR. Outbound, we had a great plane with attentive staff that produced a great overall experience, even with the odd oddity. Coming back, we also had a great plane, albeit one with seats salvaged from an aviation museum and a crew that seemed to have no idea as to what was required of them. I'd certainly fly EGYPTAIR again, but I'll be sticking to their newer equipment, where the crew's training and service standards have had less of a chance to be forgotten. So thanks for watching. Please like this video if you got something from it. Leave me a comment, what would you have done in this situation? And if you are new, please click the subscribe button and ding the notification bell. So thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all again in the next one. Goodbye.